Putin ready to facilitate unrestricted grain exports. EU to cut 90% Russia oil imports. EU embargoed oil prices continue to climb. Global refiners falter to match the demand. First cargo ship leaves Mariupol. U.S. wheat crop deficit adds to global tensions. Coal India imports for first time in years. Flu vaccine could cut COVID risk.
Hello, I'm Peggy. Thank you for joining us on FUNDAY News. It is June 1st, Wednesday, and here are your top stories. Reuters reported, according to a Kremlin readout of talks with President Tayyip Erdogan, Russian President Vladimir Putin said on May 30th that Russia was ready to facilitate the unhindered export of grain from Ukrainian ports in coordination with Turkey. Reuters reported a senior UN official had constructive discussion in Moscow on May 31st with Russian First Deputy Prime Minister Andrei Deluzov on facilitating Russian grain and fertilizer export to global markets.
According to the Kremlin, Putin added that if sanctions were lifted, then Russia could export significant volumes of fertilizers and agricultural products. It was not immediately clear which Ukrainian ports Putin was speaking of. Ukraine's main grain export ports include Kremenchuk, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Kherson, and Yuzhny. Reuters reported Putin has said Russia will increase wheat exports in the new June to July season due to a potential record crop of 87 million tons.
European Union leaders agreed in principle on May 30th to cut 90% of oil imports from Russia by the end of this year. Two-thirds of the Russian oil imported by the EU comes via tanker and one-third by the Druzhba pipeline. The embargo on seaborne oil imports would therefore apply to two-thirds of all oil imported from Russia. The remaining 10% will be temporarily exempt from the embargo so that landlocked Hungary, along with Slovakia and the Czech Republic, depends on Russian access, which they cannot easily replace.
Sanctions are biting hard and are really destroying, and that's the goal, the basis, the financial basis of Putin leading this war.
The ban on oil imports of Russian crude to EU countries will apply to shipments. It is not immediately clear how the EU will compensate member states that import crude oil by tanker for the higher cost differential than countries that continue to buy oil by pipeline. And on May 31st, EU leaders will continue to make commitments to help Ukraine ship grain by rail and land to global buyers, as the Russian Navy blocks the usual sea routes, while taking steps to accelerate its move away from reliance on Russian energy.
Oil prices continue to climb after the EU agreed to cut imports of Russian crude on May 31st, as the embargo added fuel to already tight supply concerns and a surge in demand ahead of the summer driving season in Europe and the United States. Brent crude for July rose by $1.13 to a near two-month high of $122.80 a barrel at 3:59 a.m. GMT. The more heavily traded August contract also rose by $1.34 to $118.94 per barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude oil traded at $118.25 per barrel, up $3.18 from Friday's close.
Price forward bubbling higher yet again. It's at a multi-month high, $117 the barrel. That is mighty expensive for oil.
Market analyst at CMC Markets, Tina Ten, said, the EU embargo is definitely very bullish for the oil price, building on supply tensions. The oil price is now heading to the highs in March. She noted that the reopening of China is also underpinning prices. They should draw further support as demand from China is expected to pick up after the easing of COVID-19 curbs. On the production side, OPEC Plus is set to stick to last year's deal at its meeting on June 2nd, with a modest July output hike by 432,000 barrels per day.
Global demand for diesel and gasoline has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, but the combination of pandemic closure sanctions on Russia and export quotas in China are straining refiners' ability to meet demands. China, Russia, and the U.S. are the three biggest refining countries, but now all three are below peak processing levels. This has exacerbated the high price of oil and worsened the global shortage of supply for customers. U.S. capacity is down nearly 1 million barrels from before the pandemic to 17.9 million BPD.
According to Reuters estimates, Russia has idled about 30% of its refining capacity due to sanctions. Outages are currently about 1.5 million BPD, and 1.3 million BPD will likely stay offline through the end of 2022. The IEA said China, the second largest refiner worldwide, has added several million barrels of capacity in the last decade, but in recent months has cut production due to COVID-19 restrictions and kept exports to curb refining activity as part of an effort to cut carbon emissions. China's throughput dropped to 13.1 million BPD in April, down from 14.2 million BPD in 2021.
The leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, wrote on the Telegram messaging app announced on May 31st. A ship has left the Ukrainian port of Mariupol for the first time since Russia took the city and is headed east to Russia with a load of metal. He wrote, "Today, 2,500 tons of hot-rolled sheets left the port of Mariupol. The ship headed for the Russian city of Rostov." Russia said last week that a port had been demined and was open again to commercial vessels.
Media reported steel rows are stacked on the dock before being loaded on board the RM-3 cargo ship at the port of Mariupol during Ukraine-Russia conflict in the southern city of Mariupol in Ukraine on May 30th, 2022. Ukraine said the shipment of metal to Russia from Mariupol amounted to looting. Russia seized full control of Mariupol earlier this month, where more than 2,400 Ukrainian fighters surrendered at the besieged Azovstal steelworks and created a corridor linking to Crimea.
The U.S. winter wheat harvest potential has fallen by more than 25% due to severe drought. At the same time, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture data, U.S. farmers have only seeded 49% of their intended spring wheat acres as of May 22nd, influenced by heavy rain that brought soggy soil. Market analysts said worsening harvest prospects in China and part of Europe, followed by an export ban by major producer India, have tightened stocks and exacerbated global food supply concerns.
Media reported, since the United States is the world's fourth largest wheat exporter, problems are hitting output at a time when the world cannot afford to lose any more supplies of the staple grain amid a global food crisis. Benchmark Chicago Board of Trade, wheat prices surged 50% to more than $13.60 a bushel after Russia's invasion in February halted shipments of nearly a third of the world's wheat exports, and little has gone right for wheat since then.
Reuters reported on May 28th, India's state-run Coal India, the world's largest coal miner, will import the fuel for use by utilities as shortages raise concern about renewed power outages. The Federal Power Ministry said in the letter dated May 28th, it would be the first time since 2015 that Coal India has imported the fuel, highlighting efforts by state and federal officials of India to stock up to avoid a repeat of April, when India faced its worst power cuts in more than 6 years.
India is expected to face a wider coal shortage during the third quarter of 2022 due to expectations of higher electricity demand, stoking fears of widespread power outages. The India Federal Power Ministry said in the letter dated May 28th, Coal India would import coal for blending on government-to-government basis and supply to thermal power plants of state generators and independent power producers. Media said the letter was sent to all utilities, top federal and state energy officials.
A study of more than 30,000 healthcare workers in Qatar found that those who got a flu jab were nearly 90% less likely to develop severe COVID-19 symptoms over the next few months, compared with those who hadn't recently received the flu shot. The study, which was conducted in late 2020 before the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, is in line with previous work suggesting that ramping up the immune system using influenza vaccines and other jabs could help the body to fend off the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2.
Approximately 100 years ago. In addition to protection against tuberculosis,
Mihan Natia, an infectious disease specialist at Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, tracked 518 workers who tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 and matched them to more than 2,000 study participants who had tested negative for the virus. Those who had received an influenza vaccine that season were 30% less likely to test positive for SARS-CoV-2 and 89% less likely to develop severe COVID-19 compared with workers who had not.
And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on FUNDAY News. Let's make every day a fun day. I'm Peggy, your host. I'll see you next time.